In Japan, at least 500,000 adolescents and young adults, and over 500,000 middle-aged adults have disappeared from the workforce, from training, from education, from public life. The true numbers may be even greater. The disappeared are not really missing. They're in their bedrooms. Many of them are dependent on aging parents. Some have not left their rooms in years. Many struggle to leave their rooms even to bathe or use the toilet. They do not work. They do not go to school. And for the Japanese economy, they represent a growing problem. They are called hikikomori, and their exponential growth in number is thought to be uniquely a Japanese problem. It has been referred to as a culture-bound syndrome. Or is it? The hikikomori phenomenon has been identified as a major social problem in Japan since the economic slowdown of the 1990s. Characterized by an acute, total withdrawal from social life, hikikomori are disengaged from academics and the workforce, confine themselves to their homes and especially their bedrooms for a period of at least 6 months, and avoid relationships and social situations. Conservative estimates number the population at just over 500,000, though some place their number at nearly 1.5 million. With the world's fastest aging population, Japan cannot afford to lose so many working-age people from the economy. Almost a third of the population is over 65. To put that number into perspective, the same demographic makes up closer to 16 to 18% of the population elsewhere, such as the United States, the United Kingdom, Canada, and Australia. There are simply not enough Japanese adults to fill positions left by retiring seniors. There aren't enough adults having children. The population is shrinking. So how do we explain this? What could possibly be causing this problem? And why is it so severe in Japan? It must be psychological, right? Well, that's part of it. Depression, anxiety, OCD, and schizoaffective disorder have been indicated in some cases. Clearly, social anxiety is playing a role here. Autism and other forms of neurodivergence are also common amongst hikikomori. Beyond that, there are sociological explanations. Japan is a country with a low tolerance for social deviance, so bullying is a serious problem there, and we'll talk about that more in a minute. There's also a stigma against psychiatry and mental illness. In a 2008 paper on hikikomori, cultural and medical anthropologist Amy Borovoy writes that, in 1989, when Eli Lilly tested the waters for Prozac in Japan, they were told by local experts that, quote, the Japanese barely suffer from depression, and they decided that the market was not worth the investment. Beyond that, within Japanese schools, there's a systemic lack of special accommodations for students with intellectual disabilities or developmental disorders such as autism. This is also something we'll come back to later. So we have the usual suspects: mental illness, stigma, bullying, systemic deficits, structural problems. But none of these things are unique to Japan. You could say that the United States has all of these same problems. So why don't we have a hikikomori phenomenon here? What makes Japan unique in this particular situation? Is there a cultural connection? Can anthropology shed some light on this issue? In a paper on hikikomori for the International Academic Forum, ethnopsychiatry researcher Marie Sugai breaks down the culture-bound theory by using the criteria of another, Hofstede's theory of cultural dimensions. By using 3 culture value indices, that's individualism, collectivism, power distance, and uncertainty avoidance, Sugai rates Japan as high in collectivism, with high power distance and high uncertainty avoidance. This means that in Japanese culture, the collective is of higher importance than the individual, power and status is highly stratified and highly respected, with a very low tolerance for unpredictability, resulting in rigid behavioral patterns and expectations. For context, the United States rates high in individualism, low in power distance, and medium in uncertainty avoidance. To make this contrast easy to understand, consider these two phrases. In the United States, we have the saying, "The squeaky wheel gets the grease." Those who stand out and make their opinions unignorable will see them addressed. Now compare that to this common Japanese aphorism: "The nail that stands out gets hammered down." Whereas people in the US typically value individuality, self-reliance, speaking up, in Japan, the focus is placed on the community, society, and the good of the whole. Many hikikomori cite this environment of group versus individual as a major driving factor in their withdrawal from society. There are strong sentiments about the suffocation of selfhood, identity, and individuality within Japanese cultural values present in their testimonies. Reinforcement of group values starts early. As K.H.L. Todd states in her prize-winning essay Hikikomania, the hammering down of individuals begins in the schoolyard, where bullying is prevalent. Quote, "This practice is not particularly discouraged by teachers or parents, as it promotes behavior modification that will help students fit into the group and prepares them for real life by developing skills to form and operate within the cohesive social units and the hierarchical relationships upon which Japanese society is built. Parents and teachers do not interfere, believing that the group has recognized within the bullied party some character flaw that needs to be worked out." But not every student will assimilate, and bullying is a major driving factor in the increasing rate of school refusers, which is the Japanese term for school dropouts. School refusal is often a precursor to becoming a hikikomori. The school connection doesn't end there. In sharp contrast to what we're familiar with in the United States, special education classes are just not that prevalent in Japan. In Japan, children of different aptitudes are nearly always combined in the same classes until high school. But also, the mainstreaming of children with mild developmental or intellectual disabilities is the norm. These children are in the same classrooms as their non-disabled peers through elementary school and middle school. And while this may seem inclusive, accommodation for these students is complicated. For the many who do not qualify for specialized schools due to severe disabilities, there are a few who receive special considerations. Japanese schools don't want to exclude these students from the group by othering them, and it's believed that being held to the same expectations as quote-unquote normal or high-achieving children will expose them to the expected norms of conduct and achievement and inspire compliance. Unfortunately, this practice, while applied in the interest of inclusion, can frequently result in these students falling behind academically and, of course, bullying. And later, when these children are unable to test into the highly competitive high school level, they often become school refusers and later may become hikikomori. One aspect of culture that may play a role in the hikikomori phenomenon is gender roles. Some who have studied hikikomori have investigated this connection, though your mileage may vary depending on the source. In his paper, The Poison System in Japan, neuropsychologist Kenneth Allen Adams paints an unforgiving picture of mothers in Japan. Adams takes aim at many types of mothers. The smother mothers who create, quote, claustrophobic and erotically charged intimacy with their children, at what he refers to as dragon mothers whose expectations of their children are too high to be met, and mothers who have the nerve to seek a career outside of the home. The rationale at work in this paper is certainly sexist and employs some really ethnocentric language, but it also evokes the same sort of mother blaming that once formed our understanding of conditions like schizophrenia. In Robert Kolker's sweeping 2020 profile of the Galvin family, Hidden Valley Road, Kolker details a mid-century American family with 12 children, 6 of whom would eventually be diagnosed with schizophrenia. Study of the Galvin family would eventually shape much of what we know about the condition, but early on in their struggle, Mother Mimi Galvin was blamed. In the 1960s, it was a common belief in psychiatry that schizophrenia was caused by a mother who was either too smothering or too withholding. If you were a mother of a schizophrenic child, you couldn't win. And Japan isn't unique here. We have smother mothers and withholding mothers in America. In order to gain a deeper understanding of the possible connection between gender norms and hikikomori, we have to take a closer look within the context of the culture. Let's go back for a second to disability accommodations in Japanese schools. Without widespread special education classes or special accommodations for children with learning disabilities or behavioral issues or autism, how do teachers manage their unique issues in a diverse classroom? In many schools, they don't. Oftentimes, the mothers of these children are expected to spend the school day with the child, minding them, managing their behavior, assisting them with learning and tasks. It's common for mothers of these students to attend field trips with their child to chaperone them individually. Imagine being a mother in that situation. You likely wouldn't be able to work or do much else. You'd spend the school day with your child, and then you'd go home and you'd continue to care for the family. Your entire life would revolve around providing care to this child. We also know that these children are at higher risk of becoming school refusers, and further on down the line, hikikomori. So with this understanding, it really isn't that surprising if a Japanese mother continues to feel responsible for caring for a child who's become a hikikomori. Returning again to Amy Borovoy's paper, Borovoy studied support groups for the families of hikikomori. In a particularly telling anecdote, one mother recounts a time when her hikikomori son attacked her, forcing her to call the police for help.
Occasionally he threatens us with a baseball bat, and it's quite traumatic. The other day I called the police and then was told by the neighbors that I've created a disturbance in the neighborhood.
The reason you called the police is because you don't trust your son. Your first goal should be to understand your own son.
Yes, instead of asking yourself, how shall I respond? Try asking, what is the matter? If you really understand your son, he will not behave violently. The problem is one of parent-child relations.
Understandably, views like this can make it less likely for families to seek help, and families who don't receive support are less likely to see their hikikomori child recover and rejoin society. Gender and family pressures don't just affect the families. They can also be a catalyst for a person to become a hikikomori. Since World War II, the traditional intergenerational family structure in Japan has been dramatically reshaped by the changing economy into that of a nuclear family orientation. There are huge pressures on men to have successful jobs, to get married, and to have children. Career expectations are very steep, and some men just burn out. In addition to these newer expectations, some traditional pressures from the time of intergenerational family structure still exist on top of that. If you are the eldest son, you and your wife and children may be expected to live with your elderly parents and care for them. Many hikikomori are eldest sons who burnt out from the expectations of having to earn the income required to support an entire multi-generational family. Female hikikomori have their own rigid cultural expectations. They may face a lot of family pressure to become a wife and a mother, and women who stay at home with their parents, who don't get married and instead focus on developing their career, are referred to pejoratively as parasaito, or parasites. Family is also expected to function as a group. In America, hikikomori behavior is viewed a little bit differently. If your son or daughter is a quote-unquote deadbeat, maybe you kick them out. And if they have to fend for themselves, they'll get their lives sorted out. Again, this is indicative of the high individualism index in the US. By contrast, in Japan, if your son or daughter is a hikikomori, you must care for them while they're resting. This is your responsibility. And also, you're probably responsible. It's probably your fault, Instead of asking them to get out of the house and get a job, you really should be asking yourself what you did to create this situation. Now, what happens when you get sick in Japan? Well, you rest. Mid-size and large employers have, by American standards, very generous leave options to allow for rest when you become sick or injured. We've talked a little bit about the views in Japan regarding psychiatry and medication, and rest is viewed as the correct treatment for mental health concerns, like depression or nervous breakdowns. This view of rest and withdrawal is applied to hikikomori. They have withdrawn due to pressures and stresses from life, and they're struggling, so therefore they need to rest. So they're allowed to rest. And rest, and rest. And families are responsible for caring for them during their rest. Extreme social withdrawal is not a condition that's exclusive to Japan. It happens all over the world for a variety of reasons. But nowhere in the world is the problem as severe as it is in Japan. And while there are a number of psychological and sociological reasons for this, there is value to identifying possible cultural explanations for a condition that appears to be culture-bound. As Marie Sugai stated in her article for the International Academic Forum, culture-bound is a term that indicates the native country's culture is a trigger for certain behaviors or trends. By naming a trend culture-bound, it is easier to trace cause and therefore perhaps to find solutions or appropriate ways to respond. In short, for a culture-bound issue, one has to take into account the issue within the context of that culture, because that might be the only way to identify solutions that make sense within that culture.